Right, so this has nothing to do with the actual contents, the picture up there, but I'm a relatively pessimistic person, so I like to start with a nice picture. So the idea is for you to look at it, smile, and let's move on. So what are some of the drivers behind putting this together? With what it says on there, basically we need to build, we need to densify, we need to continue urbanization. Urbanization is going to continue. But it's a question of how we do it and what we do, how well can we do it, things around, like, I don't think we necessarily need a new office tower block, a glass tower block, but perhaps we do need a new A&E department. Just what you build, how do you build, you need to build it well. And some of the new old ideas, when I say that, I mean things like the 15-minute city, which isn't a new idea per se, but it is something that is made a comeback perhaps in the last 4 months, more and more these sort of things around being able to live where you work, which requires densification, is making a bit of a comeback, even though it's not necessarily a new idea. So of course, if we're building, then we need it to be good space. Cities need to be attractive. Right now, where I am here in South London, I don't really want to be here during quarantine. I don't want to be here now because I can't. There's nothing around here for me to really do or see, and all my friends are in central London, but I can't go there. So everywhere needs to be a good place to be. Which polycentric cities, I think, is another one of those new old ideas making a comeback. So key to that, to have this thing of happy and fun cities. I think that's the key to making livable cities, and key to that is public space. Is there a clash between building and having public space? Possibly, and that's something I'm trying to explore. So how do you get around that? One way, just one way, is here's a building on stilts. So you just raise the building up, and what you could do is have that ground floor space that disappears, go on the top there, which is what that dashed line is supposed to indicate. And the space underneath the building becomes space for people to enjoy. You can sit there, you can do what you want there. It just becomes space. And just for a laugh, I've put in a drawing that I did. So this is a drawing that my colleague Nikki did for me, and this is a drawing that I did alongside some reviews from my friends when I sent it to them. I also got one saying 0 out of 10, but I think that's a bit harsh. I don't think this is that bad, really. Are there precedents? Yes. So I'll flick through several. You can go back all the way to 1600s, and there's stuff from there. It's not exactly a new idea per se. Here's some more examples. This is a really good one because you've got about 268 apartments dotted around the building, and then some of them can also look into this new public space. So that's quite cool. The skate park, which initially brought this idea into my head, walking past the South Bank. Some more. I've chosen this rather poor image from Google Maps because it's got the table tennis table there. And the idea being we can use this space to do more than just have benches necessarily. Not exactly a ground floor, exposed ground floor per se, but similar idea, I think, at the Tate in the big turbine hall. Serpentine Gallery, and a couple more. The one on the right actually is a sports court. The little green patch down there underneath the stilts is a sports hall for the center, the youth center, I think it is. So that's quite interesting. What's some of the benefits? Well, all the social benefits that you get of public space, of course. Some protection from the elements. I imagine if it's raining really heavily, people might not be out in the first place, but there is some protection, especially maybe from wind, let's say. Or really, really harsh sun, which we might get with ever hotter summers. You can sort of coincide public space and buildings, but like I said, this is just one solution. Possibly flood protection, you're lifting things out of the way, but also you could put in clever suds channels in there to try and mitigate some of the floods we're going to see as the US stick pie and the climate emergency really hits us even more than it's hitting us now. The thing about organization space for communities and youth, I haven't really thought that through, but the idea being that with all these centres being closed down thanks to cuts, perhaps this is a space where people can own and do as they want there. So it can perhaps be a congregation space if there is no other space for that. And the right to the city, the idea of buildings and the buildings, the space immediately around it and underneath it are usually private space. which is fair enough. They're generally owned by it's the building property, but the idea is, well, actually, this makes the city more permeable, and it reinforces some of that right to the city concept. Some design issues potentially, well, design solutions and issues. Obviously, you want to make it as nice as you can, so all the things in there. You want people to be able to do things in there, so it's not just blank concrete ground, but have benches, have a swing, I don't know, have a play area, have a trampoline. I'll come on to users in a second. So there's all sorts of things in there. Of course, safety and question of noise is a big one, because for the people above there, you want them to actually be happy to be there, whether it's a residential or whether it's a commercial building. Wind and accessibility and open access. Really, when I put this together, really in my mind, I'm thinking it needs to be a place where anyone can go in. So it's got to be inviting. It's got to be somewhere quite welcoming. Users, limits your imagination. You tell me. You can have a book club on a Monday, a yoga class on a Friday. Saturday could be just Children's Day, where some sort of soft toys and play stuff is brought in. I don't have a kid, so I don't know what I mean by play stuff, but I don't know, toys. Pokemon. No, I'm kidding. You know, there are things you can bring in, like a swing set, slide maybe. So it could be quite a useful space to do all sorts of stuff. Idea being it's permanently impermanent, and so it can be whatever you want it to be. You don't necessarily have to. Let's not over-engineer it, I think, is what I'm trying to say, or over-engineer parts of it but leave other parts a bit more blank. Let it be what people want it to be. Let it be what people think that they want to use it for. Let's not stop stuff from happening and over-engineer things. Development options. My understanding of development is slightly limited, but I'll give it a go. So one option is to just have the entire thing run by a developer, and the developer uses the funds from selling the flats or the rent above whatever it is, and funds the entire thing, including the ground floor, which should be cheaper to design considering there aren't any sort of internal partitions and whatnot. It does mean you lose slight rent, which could perhaps go on the top floor, or you could have half a building. So half the footprint is a retail shop, let's say, the other half is public space. Another option, drawing on from community land trust, is this idea of, I don't know how well this would work, but the idea of a community land trust where the community own that land and therefore the houses above become cheaper because you don't have to buy the land. And then any increase in that land value can be extracted as things are sold to fund other things in the area, like a children's playground, for instance, or a park. Perhaps there's something in here where the council retains the freehold and then just sells the airspace above with a nominal maintenance fee, perhaps with the ground floor. Conscious not to call it ground rent because ground rents have had a lot of bad press. In all fairness, they are not the nicest things and can get quite predatory. So you can replace the ground floor with an additional story, like I said, so that might give a bit of an incentive to the builder to do so. And I know the tagline for this, the sort of marketing material did say that an entire city could be raised, but I think perhaps you start with some locations. I'm not entirely sure you need to have it all over the city, now that I think about it. An entire city raised up. And it just sounds a bit dystopian almost to me, although you could put in bike lanes. Maybe there's something there. In certain zones, in certain areas, definitely more inner city than outer city. Other thoughts, this doesn't replace parks and open space. It can't, nothing can. You need that as well. But the idea here is this creates some more space, perhaps around a plaza, perhaps in somewhere like the City of London, I think could really do with it, or the corners of Oxford Circus, where there's no space to actually walk around. The pavements are really small, and I don't like Oxford Street, and this could make it a bit more bearable. That quote in there, I'm just leaving it in there. You can read it. Not much else to say. It's a bit of a mouthful, but it does. I really like it as a sentence to sort of say, let's put stuff together, put it in the city, and not try and again over-engineer it, and just see what organically comes up and what sort of identity it develops as time progresses. Maintenance. How do you fund things? I guess that's the question for everything. How do you fund anything? And what is the future city? Like I said, I'm not convinced it's an entire city on stilts, but possibly large sections with bike lanes and whatnot running through it. That is it. I will stop at this lovely picture which my colleague drew. I'm really jealous of this drawing ability. I appreciate architects can do this, but it's, to me, it's just wow. Like, you can put this together in 30 minutes. That's amazing. Anyway, yep, that's me done. Christine.
Thanks so much for that. If you can unshare your screen, and then I'm going to start inviting in some of your feedback panel. But I liked your sketch too. It had real passion in it, even if you got a bit panned. So I'm just sending invitation. We've got Adam Thorpe, who's going to be feeding back to you. We've got Will Sandy coming back to the stage. And sorry. That's my sound when things go wrong. Everybody's got a sound, a Zoom sound or an Airmeet sound. Mine goes like this. Oh, you hear that a lot. We've got Tara coming back, and we've got Sue Morgan coming back. I'm going to kick off with Sue this time because she went last time, but I think it would be great to hear from you initially, Sue, about your feedback.
Hi, great. Thank you, Jaffer. That was amazing. Really good. I loved it. Loved the idea that you talked about flexibility, that you also sort of talked about reuse and repurpose, that you talked about community land trusts and empowerment. That's great. I also like that you thought about the finance through. So I think, there's kind of well-rounded response. Also that you mentioned all the grand challenges, that Design Council are working on, age, homes, skills, cities, economies, those things all sort of fit. Interesting observation from my perspective is that, there were plans in the 1930s for Regent Street to be a kind of whole kind of city street up on stilts to accommodate cars. So kind of like flip on what you were saying, but, there's these things have been thought through. I also think it's interesting because there are some really good examples that not necessarily on stilts, but I think accommodating these smaller spaces like Paley Park in New York, the Angel building where Design Council were for quite a while, the whole downstairs floor through Section 106 was open to the public. And I think that's also a model that's been used by a number of corporate buildings in America, usually funded through business improvement districts, where the whole of the ground floor ends up being open to sort of public access. Sometimes it's for a short period of time, but it's a great model, and something that we should probably think of here. I'm also minded of the Westway Trust over in North Kensington near Grenfell. I used to work there at an urban study centre many years ago, and the Westway Trust is a really fantastic example of how to reuse all that unused space underneath the motorway. Slight issues with air quality, given all the particles that come off. And I think also work that we do with Network Rail and looking at how Network Rail arches are used is also another example of kind of the city on stilts, or the spaces in between and the spaces underneath. So I think that all sort of really chimes really well with me. I think, practically speaking, I think what's correlation between the two presentations, yours and the others, is the boring stuff. It's like, who owns the land? How can we do it? So I immediately go into kind of thinking in granular detail about how that would manifest itself. But I think the fact that there are a number of really good case study examples that align themselves with your idea, would help, add grist to the mill in terms of making that business case. But I think, yeah, great, thank you.
Brilliant. Adam, can I bring you in? Because we haven't heard from you yet in this session. It'd be good to hear.
Sure, thank you. Thanks very much for the presentation, Jaffer. I really like the overall idea that you're presenting there. I agree that we need more non-prescriptive covered public spaces, especially now. My concern is that if we're talking about public spaces, then the trend seems to be in the opposite direction, as many councils and public institutions are forced to seek revenues from their spaces, whilst privately owned spaces are the ones that seem to be able to offer public spaces, ironically, as they seek to gain from the activation and cross-pollination that serendipity of public space provides. So I think there are a number of great examples, as Sue points out. I think that we can learn from these examples as well, like the South Bank Undercroft and the Save the Undercroft campaigns I'm sure you're all aware of, which is a great example where even the South Bank found itself entertaining the possibility of commercialising existing elements of the Undercroft to generate revenues for expansion of its public offer. So then we end up in this sort of cultural conflicts about, are we talking about the culture inside the building or the culture outside the building? Should they be forced to compete? I don't think many of us would think they should. Around CSM, Central St Martin's, which is where I'm based, we've got a couple of examples. So we've got a place called The Crossing, which runs through the bottom of the granary building, which is public space within the college space between the two entrances. And also the Canopy Market, which sits to the right of the building as you in front of Waitrose there, to those that are familiar with it. These are open to the public, but they're privately owned and managed. And so they're not open to all of the public for all purposes. And in addition to that, one of the problems that faces public ownership of space, as you pointed out, and I thought it was really interesting, I appreciated the fact that you raised the problem around management and maintenance. And it seems to me in some instances that public sector is offloading public spaces to private management and ownership in many instances, not just because of revenues to deliver essential services, but also the cost of maintenance and management of some of these spaces. So I think it's really interesting to try to think through and work out the answer to the questions that you were raising about who would we imagine is going to manage these spaces and who's going to pay for the management of these spaces. We could point to people like the Camerados public living rooms, a very modest in terms of scale example, but in these spaces are managed by the people that use them according to a kind of sort of mutually understood and evolved social contract. And how does that fit within or without these sort of private public spaces? Or are we going to find a way where they're not private public spaces, they're public spaces? Now, is it possible that at that stage in the planning process, we're able to in advance nominate assets of community value in the way that we can at the end of the process when someone's about to knock something down, we say, oh, don't knock that down, that's an asset of community value. Well, in the process of looking at stuff, could we say in that early stage, hang on a minute, we think that's an asset of community value or has potential to be. And so we demand the right, or not demand, but we have the right to be able to access that asset of community value and get the opportunity to see if we can fundraise for it. So I think you raised some really interesting points, and I hope we find a way to realise some of your vision, because I certainly think we need it. Thank you.
Thanks, Adam. Tara, can I ping to you to?
Yes, of course. Thank you so much, Jaffer. That was a really brilliant presentation, and I agree with a lot of the comments already made by my fellow panelists. I guess what I would want to build upon is actually how could we use these spaces with existing buildings? I think absolutely the idea of raising buildings on stilts, but could we go through a program, or could there be an exploration of a program of going around the city, going around areas to find existing buildings that could accommodate these types of spaces? And in that process, actually, it's quite an engaging one. So not necessarily a company being set up to do that, but actually it's students who do that, local students, local residents, local businesses who get to engage with that, because actually they are the ones who then create the agency to potentially force change through or encourage gently change through. One of the points you picked, of course, is that these spaces could be formal, informal, open to user type, user base. And I wondered actually, is there a danger that when it's so open, which always tends to happen, certainly with design, when there's such a broad spectrum of user, it's quite difficult to design. So actually whether there could be this digital program thinking about who appropriates the space. Is it students one day, or is it local businesses the other day, or is it markets the other day? So actually, even though it can be appropriated by different types of people, thinking of the quality of these spaces, because of course some of them you could potentially knock out. If we're looking at existing buildings, for example, you can potentially knock out all the ground floor windows, but where some of them have the have that structure in place and it's more open and closed. Some spaces are more appropriate for particular uses. And so therefore just thinking about how those work together, the user and the type of space, and whether a digital program can be created to accommodate that. But I think the key point for me really is in the creation of that process of existing building, and it's that engagement to create that.
Brilliant. Will, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Jaffer. I love this idea. I think it's great. And, building on what Sue was saying earlier about us having to embrace a kind of European stance on congregation, these covered spaces are going to become, come into their own. I've just written down the word, the great indoors, that idea of this sort of blurred line between indoor and outdoor. And I think there's too many thresholds across the city where there's a sort of lobby buzzer culture where you do get to go and look at the art, but ultimately it's quite exclusive. You have to kind of go run the gauntlet of whether you're worthy enough by the security or the man in the yellow. And so I think, this is a really good idea. I think there's a conflict we've seen on the South Bank between the commerciality and the community, and how, owners see the value in what you're presenting is something we need to look at, the management, the maintenance. We've got challenges with a 24-hour city. It's a perfect place for people to sleep as well. So, how do we manage that? We've got a huge problem with that in all the cities, across the world. But I think, looking at what Tara was saying, why don't we identify, we walk past all these timber chevrons that where a commercial outlet's going to be at the bottom of a block of flats, and they're empty. So can't we just look at programming those as kind of urban rooms or programmatic spaces until the Tesco's, Co-op, whatever, wants to go in there and become that tenant below the lovely flats that we're all seeing go up everywhere? There's a wealth of spaces. The Westway Trust proves that. The Archco with Network Rail are looking at all these different occupations. I think as much as I'd love to see every new build have a lifted floor, we can also start to identify, as these guys have been saying, existing opportunities across the city.
Great. Jaffer, do you want to come back just before we switch to our next speaker?
Yeah. On the thing about ground floors that are sort of enclosed, as Sue is pointing to, I think one day far in the future we'll be in a place where we feel comfortable going into those spaces, but I always sort of walk past the place and think, am I actually allowed to be there? Can I not be in there? Which is why I guess for this idea, I sort of proposed not having those enclosing walls. But I hope we get there one day. I really hope we do. I hope it becomes normal. The thing about privately owned public space and POPs, and there's been a whole, I guess, raft of news stories about that in the last couple of years. I'm afraid that the whole thing about you talking about community and who owns spaces, the thing about South Bank, I'm afraid that all just comes down to ideology and policy. I think is my. I don't think those are design solutions. I don't think anyone can design these buildings so that they don't have those contradictions. It is a question of policy and ideology. Do you believe in public ownership? Do you believe in private ownership? Do you believe in free market completely versus not? I think that's where this battle will be fought when won or lost. The thing about valuing things that I think is quite interesting. So when we say, yes, there's a commercial incentive for South Bank to give up that space and commercialize it, so to speak. Well, actually, Newham Council, I think, in a month or so ago, they've taken on social things like well-being and happiness as their indicators for coming out of COVID recovery, so for having COVID recovery, rather than necessarily a pound sign. And perhaps there's something in there where if we change how we measure the outputs of these spaces, well, then something like my idea or like the skate space will suddenly be really attractive because you can show that it has all these benefits. It's just not necessarily a direct monetary benefit, but it'll have so many other benefits, like, I don't know, cutting down the cost of the NHS because people are getting out more, things like that. Yeah, big fan of advancing community value, which ties into what Tara was saying about having a program plan and what Will was saying as well. Yeah, why not walk around the city and identify these spaces? We've built a lot of our cities already. A lot's being built where you could do this stills thing, but I'm not advocating tearing buildings down and re-putting them up, because the greenest building is the building that's not built, so to speak, right? So we don't want to be tearing things down. We've got to control our carbon. So absolutely, let's walk around the city and figure out where this could happen, and then as buildings come up for refurbishment every 15, 20 years, whatever it is, then we can look into carefully designing it so that you can create more of this ground floor public space.
Brilliant. Jaffer, I'm going to leave it there because we've got to get to our next
That's
speaker. But
yeah,
thanks so much. I thought that was great. And thank you so much for our sounding panel. I'm going to do my magic elimination. So everybody give a wave.